Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our next TARO webinar, TARO and ArchivesSpace Open Forum. I'm joined today with representatives from a few of the different institutions who are working with ArchivesSpace software, who are going to talk about how they are navigating TARO 2's new website and exporting their files from ArchivesSpace. Today, we're going to hear from Brian Thomas and Becky Romachuk from the Texas State Library and Archives down in Austin. Amanda Folke is going to be talking about RICE and what they're doing down there in Houston. And Olivia DeSalis from the Briscoe Center for History is also going to be presenting her work. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We're going to moderate that and do some Q&A and open discussion at the end of all the presentations. But as we have a full slate of wonderful talks today, I'm going to turn this over to Brian Thomas, who's going to kick it off from TSLAP.
Hello. So I'm going to share my screen, one of them, and let's see. Here we go. All right. So for the Texas State Library and Archives Commission, we are currently in two different stages when it comes to ArchivesSpace. We have the implementation of ArchivesSpace locally in our own systems, as well as making sure that when we have something in ArchivesSpace that we're pushing it to TARO in a format that is as much as possible meeting the data requirements. So a little brief history of how it is that we're at this particular spot. I'm not saying it's a bad spot, just saying where we're at. Back in 2012, 2013, we had been talking about implementation of Archivist Toolkit. Unfortunately, that actually never got implemented. And by the time Archives was in a position to start an implementation, we had ArchivesSpace as the latest and greatest. So that's what we started focusing on like getting our data into the system. The first thing we started out with when it came to implementation, the low-hanging fruit for us was importing the session records. We have, I think it's like 7,000 accession records, so that took a little bit of time. And then we started actually using the accession functionality within ArchivesSpace. After that, or towards the end of using implementation of the accession functionality, we started using resource functionality as a method of creating appraisal records for things that needed a more in-depth appraisal than a simple yes/no. And then more recently, in the last year or so, we've got into production creation of finding aids in ArchivesSpace, as well as importing existing existing finding aids into ArchivesSpace. The scope of the problem we have that we're dealing with at the moment is that ArchivesSpace finding aids, as most of you are already aware, aren't necessarily TARO 2 data requirement compliant. For instance, the encoding analog, which is a definite requirement for TARO 2, isn't something that ArchivesSpace does natively. And so you have to figure out a way to put that into the EAD code. At the same time, we also have the fact that if we have something that is TARO 2 compliant that hadn't yet been imported into ArchivesSpace, it's not always friendly with what ArchivesSpace needs. So we have a little crosstalk there. An example would be that extent for something in ArchivesSpace to TARO 2 is the pluralization of extent types. So what I mean is when you say like file as opposed to files, and having like, if you don't pluralize or depluralize that, you look at having whatever the extent type but doubled to have the different nomenclature, and then that's not useful for managing your data. So what we have a two-step process going on right now. We have the finding aids that had been previously made TARO 2 data requirement compatible that we went through, and that process was, guys, it's already 2 years ago, year and a half ago. And then the sorts of things that we did with that. So we have the TARO 2 compliant finding aids that need to then be pushed into ArchivesSpace, and then on the flip side, taking that and pushing ArchivesSpace back out. So to get something TARO 2 compliant, ArchivesSpace idealized, you need to add the date normal attribute, the top level unit ID, which was not a requirement for TARO, is a requirement in ArchivesSpace. So adding that, which in our case isn't actually the EAD ID that we use for TARO. Removing all those trailing and leading punctuation in title, extent, and date. An example being removing the trailing commas in the unit date that make it so that when you're in ArchivesSpace, you have the double punctuation. Like I said a moment ago, pluralizing extent for consistency so that you only have one type of extent. Then controlled access, which is very useful in navigating in TARO 2 with the nesting structure where you have the overall parent, and then for each type of a control access, you have this set up. Does it actually import properly? And then getting legacy container verbiage. So if we used film to represent both microfilm and film, then differentiating that so that it can be very clear when you import data what you're referring to. So the workflow that we go through with that is an archivist will do hand data remediation, fixing legacy data issues that may exist. And these binaries have been created over a period of, I want to say 20 years, and Becky can correct me on that. It's been about 20 years, right?
EAD finding aids, yes, 20 years, but a lot of those represent description created 20 years before that as well. So it can get really kind of squirrely.
Right. So the archivist completes the data remediation that they've done, that they've been assigned to work on. It gets a final pre-check before it gets imported into ArchivesSpace. And then the Pi guy, which would be me, runs the normalization script that we have to be able to make it ArchivesSpace compliant. Then I will import the finding aid so that it is it's in the system. I know what a lot of the data errors that creep up might be that can't be fixed with a Python script. So I go in and I try and correct those as much as possible. There's probably a fix, but I just don't have the technical know-how right now to be able to fix a few of those. And then the archivist, after I go through that step, also goes in and corrects any kind of issues that came up that I didn't notice through a QC process. All right, so in terms of stuff that is now in ArchivesSpace that needs to be pushed out to TARO 2, typically our workflow, if it's not already in ArchivesSpace, we don't import it just to then export it to TARO 2. What we do is we have the TARO 2 version, and then we provide that, and then we import into ArchivesSpace after. But in the case of finding aids that have been imported and now need to go to TARO, what we need to do to make it TARO 2 data requirement compliant is to add a sub area to corporate entities in origination. I believe also any 710 field, 110, and 610. If you're using the encoding analog equivalent. push most of the agents that are in ArchivesSpace lumped together into a nested controlled access. Add those encoding analog attributes that don't exist in an ArchivesSpace export. And I can just read through this or y'all can read it. Basically, just rework the data to get like certain specific things taken care of. Like we have a stylistic choice within FizzDesk at the item level, we have brackets. So it would be so that the extent actually shows up in brackets as opposed to just being one other thing, one other number. So using a style sheet to then apply that. Or ArchivesSpace exports extent so that you have extent, the number, and then genre form for the type. In addition to fixing the numbers involved in that, so that the pluralization involved in that, actually concatenating the extent so that it's all within one extent tag to make it more system friendly. Re-adding that commas that where applicable in unit title and unit date. I have here that inserting a catalog identifier that which I had mentioned a couple slides before, but there are a few things being reused from the previous script that have been left in to make sure that catch anything that wasn't caught during the ArchivesSpace import that still needs to go through data remediation using the ArchivesSpace API. Another example on the bottom is fixing miscellaneous consistency things in text, like where a container type may be box, but one was imported into ArchivesSpace using a lowercase b box and one was an uppercase b box. Those are the sorts of things that we intend to go back and fix at a later time once we have all the finding aids in the system, because there's sure to be additional little minor errors that pop up. And right now we're at, by my calculation, 52.6% in the system, as we have 800 and I want to say 7 or 837 finding aids on TARO. And we have 352 finding aids already in the system, with 109 going to be put in this week. So the workflow we're going through with doing this is that when an archivist has been working on something in ArchivesSpace and they're ready to have it be published to TARO, they'll notify me that it's ready to go. I will export that finding aid and process it using the scripts that we have, that I have already set up, and then do some of my own like pre-check to make sure that some of these things that I may not have been able to fix have been taken care of. For instance, maybe I will run a XSL transform to HTML so people can kind of visually check how it would render. And then the archivist also does a pre-check before it's published on TARO, pushed over to TARO for publication. So a few notes before I go over to the actual like Python programming side that I want to show is that right now our limitation is that we're using Python scripts and there's only one of me. So if I go on vacation or get hit by a bus, some of this normalization either to TARO or to ArchivesSpace has a certain weakness there. I also have a GitHub if anybody wants to copy that down and take a look. Pretty much everything that I'm working on goes up there, and it's freely available for anybody to use. I use it as a backup, so it isn't as consistent as you might see like from something with DU, where they very obviously curated it for perfection. One of the things that we do in this process is that we iteratively change our scripts when problems arise. For instance, I will work on a script exporting a finding aid, and then Becky will be like, hey, did you realize it was doing this particular thing? I'm like, okay, no, I didn't. So I'll work through trying to get it. I'll work through trying to get that finding aid to the programming to incorporate that change. So one of the benefits of doing Python is you can do that, is you can just go, okay, I'm gonna now add this new thing I have to fix and just knock it out relatively quickly. One of the things that we're going to be doing in the future, once we have all of our finding aids in ArchivesSpace, is we're going to be able to normalize system errant data issues, for instance, pluralizations that didn't get done right. And then we're going to look at the possibility of doing a plugin to make TARO 2 export possible. I mean, anything's possible with technology. So hopefully we can hack out how to do that. And then maybe if we're able to do that, share what we're able to come up with, or collaborate with somebody else in the TARO environment to get something that's a minimum viable product, where it may not be stylistically perfect for everybody's needs, but at least it meets something that will be TARO friendly. All right, so I believe I have just a few more minutes. So I'm going to show the environment I'm working in. This is the corresponds to what I have in GitHub. And these are the two primary scripts we used. So the one that sends everything to TARO has some major components in it. For people who are familiar with Python, will be easier to read. But basically, I have a section here to deal with issues that come up where a subject maybe has a trailing period and it shouldn't, or doesn't have a period and it should. Another section to deal with things in the origination, the 110, 710, 610 field, and making sure that that's properly broken up. Another section to deal with making sure that date formatting is proper. And then the primary workhorse for making sure everything's good for TARO data requirements is a embedded XSL style sheet that takes the raw data and then reconfigures it to be the correct thing. Now, it seems a little counterintuitive to use two different programming languages, but there are some things you can do with style sheets that you just can't do with Python, in the same way that there are some things you can do with Python that you just can't do with style sheets. So I'm gonna scoot this down to the bottom. And farther down to the bottom, you can see it took a little bit of time to create this. And then there's a couple sections that I have in this particular program or script that is actually just straight text replacement, where I couldn't hack out how to do it either way. So I just said, okay, let's just replace this text. I can't get this to work in XSL, so let's just do it this way. So I'm gonna pop over to a different screen and kind of show a difference between things. So this is the TARO 2 finding aid for finding aid 30056. And you can see, like, probably the biggest pain point for us has been this comma that you get here that you don't get out of ArchivesSpace. So in ArchivesSpace proper, you'll see that there's actually commas here. Of course, that did that. But you can see on the side here that there's a comma after the date, and that's system generated. Whereas if I were to do a straight export out of ArchivesSpace, there is no comma here. So someone won't know if this is the title or if we're doing the date section. So after that gets processed for TARO 2, I'm not gonna say magically, but it has that comma reinserted so that people will know definitely we're talking about a date versus some continuation of a title. And that's both all the time I have and all I can do without actually running the script. So I'm gonna pass the baton to the next person.
Thank you so much, Brian. That was amazing. So next up, we're going to hear from Amanda Foki and her work down with.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm going to share my screen. I have some things to share with you that are a little bit in line with what Brian was talking about, but I'm going to talk about it from a different angle, so I hope that's helpful to people. We have been members at Rice University of TARO since 2002, which is when I started at Rice, and there had not been any XML creation before then, and so we just had a mix of different kinds of legacy finding aids that we marked up by hand at first in XMetal and then in Oxygen, and then along the way we started using Archivist Toolkit, and then we implemented ArchivesSpace in 2015, as you see there. And so, you know, none of those systems are perfect. All of us who've been working with EAD and TARO over the years, like, we all have our various challenges, but, and we'll talk about some of those in a few minutes. So I would say none of this is perfect, but we are glad to be using ArchivesSpace because it does help us with some problems that we really didn't like, and we felt like the trade-off problems that we have are tolerable. So kind of moving in that direction. We do have a lot of finding aids in TARO now, over 1,000. In ArchivesSpace world, we have one repository for our place. I have thought about that some over time. We just have a repository known as the Woodson Research Center. But within our repository, we have kind of two areas, and I have thought of splitting it into two repositories, but we haven't done that yet. But we have university archives that are really, they're big enough to be their own repository, and then what we call our manuscript collections that are non-university archives. So, you know, I think we would want to do some testing that relates to user experience, searching our finding aids if they're in two different repositories and such. But so we're using ArchivesSpace 2.7.1. We have a small department of archivists who work with TARO and ArchivesSpace. There are 5 of us who do that. But all 5 of us who do that do a million other things also. So it's not any one person's job to be in charge of it, which may make sense to change in the future. But that's the version of ArchivesSpace that we're using, and we don't use the reference module currently. So people can't use like the request feature and such in our ArchivesSpace instance, but we might do that in the future. So challenges for us just over time, our hand encoding environment, our Archivist Toolkit environment, our ArchivesSpace environment, they all have various challenges when it comes to authority control and name headings and subject headings. You're probably already familiar with those possibilities. So I know there is the LC name authority plugin that might be helpful for that, but we just have a lot of legacy data in there from all these years of encoding in different systems, where it is possible to have like agent headings and subject headings and such that incorrectly name their source. So it's possible to have some messy problems like that. And then in any system, you have to find some kind of way to track the status of your TARO uploads. So we used to do that with a spreadsheet, So it's kind of clunky to be working in one system and then have to go update a spreadsheet internally to say that you sent something to TARO. It used to be easy in the previous TARO environment to see the upload dates. You know, I think you can still see that now. I would have to go and look, but we do use ArchivesSpace to track our TARO upload dates. So that's kind of handy for us. And then, so similar to what Brian was saying, we have problems exporting ArchivesSpace EAD that is TARO compliant. Generally speaking, we have the same kinds of problems that Brian was describing. I won't go into them in a lot of detail, but I think it was really helpful to see his detailed bullet lists of what the nature of those problems are. As he said, it's primarily attributes for elements and some required elements that are required now for TARO compliance that maybe we wouldn't have had in our finding aids in the past. The control access tags for subject headings and genre formats and name headings are not exported in a way that works for TARO. So that has to be fixed. And a simple thing, but it is something that takes time, is, you know, just renaming the files that come out into the TARO format of the 5-digit file name. And so we thought about using a style sheet in the XML editor to make those changes. So, you know, pretty much if you know what the changes need to be, then you just need to find the tool that your team likes to use to fix them. And so in the past, we had been used to working with style sheets in Oxygen as the XML editor, because you can just set it up and click a button to transform it into HTML and see what it looks like. So we could have made a style sheet that did transformations from one XML version to another XML version that would be TARO compliant. But we don't have in-house style sheet expertise. And so that's something that we would have had to outsource. But we do have some Python in-house expertise. Not in our department though, like we have enough just to be dangerous, or just enough to communicate with our Python script writer. And so we decided to go ahead and leverage the Python script expertise that we have in-house. And so we worked with a programmer in our IT department who also has a lot of other things on his plate, but he was kind enough to give us some of his time to build a script to deal with our problems. So we started with the TARO Best Practices Guidelines document, the BPG, and we built just a narrative kind of logical map of the EAD that we had versus the EAD that we needed. So we just went through the best practices guidelines and compared it exactly to what was going on in our exported XML, and then made notes for our programmer about it's exporting like this, and we need it to export like this instead. So a lot of his script writing was, if you see this encoding structure, then change it to this. So it's if then loops in Python. And so if we could articulate what we needed in that kind of if then logic, mostly that worked for communicating with the Python help that we had. And so this is the Python script environment that we have, a little screenshot of it for you. So our team, like I said, we have a little bit of Python experience, and we like it if we can just push this button here that says run this script.bat. And so basically our workflow is that we export the XML from ArchivesSpace into this first folder that's called exported. That's where the exported files go. And then we can come down here and say run the script, click, click, and that runs the script. And then in a perfect world, nothing goes wrong. There wasn't anything weird going on that we didn't catch when we did our pre-review, like Brian was talking about, that the humans do some pre-review in ArchivesSpace to look for any problems in the finding aid, then we export it. So if the script works correctly, then it copies a file of the old XML into this processed local folder, and it gives us the new edited file in the Ready for Tarot folder. And it's all like the file name is Tarot formatted and everything should be ready to rock in terms of Tarot compliance. And so as you can see, there's also a folder called Problems for Amanda. That's my special folder for what happens when you click the run this script.bat file script and it fails. Those folders, I mean, those files go in the problem folder for me to go in and sort out what is the picky problem that caused this. And then, like Brian was saying, we have an iterative process of going back and tweaking the Python script as we need to, or it could have been something that we missed in ArchivesSpace that we should have fixed. And then we can just go through the process again. And then, so this is kind of our little environment of how we work with things. So some of the problems in the Problems for Amanda folder were things like the script wouldn't run but the file was valid. Sometimes the script won't run and it's because the file wasn't exporting as a valid file from ArchivesSpace anyway. Or it could have been a finding aid that had no creator. You know, it was an unknown creator. There should have been a creator tag that said unknown, but there wasn't one. And so for Tarot compliance, there has to be some kind of creator, even if it's just unknown. So things like that. Our main problem has been, so we're able to fix those things. We understand those things and have solutions. The additional problem I have is that we have a lot of digital archival objects, the DAO element. And sometimes they point to public facing materials that have a full working URL, and that's no problem. But when we have digital objects that relate to things in our nearline, like dark archive, that you can only get by a facilitated, conversation request, but they are digital, so we want them to be represented as digital objects. ArchivesSpace exports it as a dead link. So we're working on that. We have a solution that we think is going to be able to be implemented this summer. So you can stay tuned for that. But any of you who are using ArchivesSpace for Tarot, if you have any digital objects that don't involve a public link, you will have that problem too and have to deal with it. So be curious if other people have solutions they've liked for that. Part of Tarot upgrades, of course, is the subject browse terms. And so we went through, we made a big spreadsheet of all of our finding aids. We made columns for the for possible Tarot subject terms from the browse list that's new with the upgrade. And then we went through and added what we thought the appropriate browse terms should be for any given collection. And then our friend in IT who helped us with the Python script also interacts with the API for ArchivesSpace. And he was able to use this spreadsheet to apply to all of those records at once. And so, we just did the work in a spreadsheet where we could feel like we had our heads around what was happening and do some analysis of it before it went into the system. And then he just popped it into the system. So now we're in a position where we need to export everything again and upload it to Tarot. So we'll be having another tracking spreadsheet to track that kind of work. And then I just want to mention that we have custom reports that are Python scripts that we do from ArchivesSpace that we like, that answer specific questions for us that we felt like we couldn't really do with the standard reports that are possible in ArchivesSpace. And so these, you can see the kind of reports that we have that we like to look at from time to time in different ways to plan work and all of that. So these are all things that we would be willing to share too. I liked that Brian shared his GitHub source. we could do that as well. We feel like ours are a little, you know, specific to our instance. And so they would need some care and feeding documentation to help people understand exactly how to edit them to make them work for their repository. But it's certainly possible, and we've really enjoyed having the custom reports. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amanda. Last up, we're going to hear from Olivia Salas down at the Briscoe Center to talk about their work with ArchivesSpace and TARO 2. So Olivia, take
it. Okay, can you see my screen? Hold on.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Okay, so hello, my name is Olivia Salis, and I'm the metadata coordinator for the Briscoe Center. This presentation is a broad overview of how we used ArchivesSpace to remediate finding aids for TARO 2.0. This presentation assumes basic familiarity with ArchivesSpace and its various record types and EAD structure. So some background about our ArchivesSpace instance. It's hosted by TAC, or Texas Advanced Computing Center, a UT Computer Research Center that also provides storage and hosting services. We migrated our EAD finding aids from ArchivesSpace from 2017 through 2019, and up until TARO 2.0 remediation, we only exported and replaced finding aids on TARO as they needed updating for accruals, corrections, and so forth. So we could identify any residual migration issues at the proofing stage. We're running version 2.8.1, and we manage this instance ourselves, which has pros and cons. On the plus side, we can customize display, do bulk changes, and access our data at any time. We can develop and/or install plugins to extend core functionality. We control upgrades. We don't need approval from IT or administrators to make changes to the software, and it's fun to learn skills and solve problems. Cons, it requires some technical proficiency. We do all the testing and troubleshooting, and we have to figure out allocations for RAM and so forth. We have a development server for testing and a production server for live data. And we periodically sync dev with prod. We store periodic data dumps on TAC in case of catastrophe. We have a custom EAD exporter customized by our fantastic systems archivist, Nate Hutchison. And at the time of remediation, we had over 4,000 records in TARO. We learn as we go, and we lean heavily on publicly available information by other ArchivesSpace users. Many of our major strides forward are modeled by work other institutions have generously shared. So we began full TARO 2.0 remediation in January 2021 and formed a TARO compliance working group of 6 people. First, I analyzed our latest monthly error report from TARO to determine the likely way we were going to approach each error, prioritizing fixes for required TARO fields. Since most of our finding aids on TARO hadn't been re-exported from ArchivesSpace and reposted to TARO, our error reports reflected a pre-ArchivesSpace state for those records. It was soon evident that our exporter already would or could be updated to fix most of the major errors we were getting dinged for. Missing calendar attribute on unit date is an example of an error best handled by the exporter. It's always going to be Gregorian for us, and it's not a field we want processors to have to fill out. Ideally, this should be handled by the exporter. Our best strategy was going to be to make any change the exporter couldn't, one by one or bulk. Update our exporter to handle compliance errors when appropriate, and bulk export EAD and repost all our finding aids. So right off the bat, ArchivesSpace gets you a ways towards TARO compliance. For instance, extents and dates are required for resource records, and they're also required for TARO 2.0. You can't have a subject record in ArchivesSpace without the source filled out, and sources and subjects are likewise required in TARO. Starting in version 2.7, ArchivesSpace made language a required field for resource records, and the corresponding lang material tag is a TARO requirement. During remediation, this added feature convinced us to jump from the version we were running at the time, 2.4.1, to the current version, then current version, 2.8.1. In the remediation process, we also decided to take advantage of default values in ArchivesSpace, the resource records, default values, to strongly encourage TARO required and preferred fields. And this changed our workflows. We'd previously spawned resource records directly from accessions, but new resources don't get the default values if you do that. So processors now create records through the create dropdown. So for instance, when a resource record is created now, an agent link with a pre-filled creator role is part of the record. Processors need to add an agent name and agents to save the record. 4 pound signs represent the TARO ID and finding a data fields to encourage correct syntax for EAD IDs. We include default notes TARO wants and prefers. We use all caps to indicate text to replace and asterisks to indicate other instructions. ArchivesSpace requirements won't address every error though. For every remaining compliance error, I queried the database to retrieve records the error applied to. The query on screen is asking ArchivesSpace for the ArchivesSpace ID, TARO link, and title of any resource without an abstract, a TARO required field. The database returns the query results with pipes and dashes to form a table. It's my practice to transform the output into a tab separated value document in BBEdit, a text editor that allows you to save, find, and replace statements. Ideally, essentially I replace pipes with tabs and make the data pastable into a spreadsheet. In the spreadsheet, you can formulaically create links to resource records based on the ID, part of the link to any staff side resource. So fixers could jump straight to the problematic records. We kept a folder with spreadsheets for every outstanding compliance error. Often we just use the spreadsheet to track and fix all the records with a particular error. If the solution required opening ArchivesSpace record to see what to do, we manually fix things in the record itself. Then we mark the issue as checked off before moving on to the next. An example of such a case is fixing a missing abstract where you have to replace, read the finding aid to write anything useful. For some errors though, bulk updates were a better solution. As you can, if you can envision fixing an error with a find and replace or some other cleanup easier to do in a spreadsheet, a bulk update is the way to go. If you want to impose consistency across a field in ArchivesSpace, that's also better done in bulk. Example 1, batch updating records missing preferred citations. The text is formulaic and you don't have to open the records to fix them. Example 2, we decided to make language governing access consistent during remediation, which was more efficiently and consistently done outside of ArchivesSpace. In 2016, Duke University posted about its Python script that it uses to update major record types in ArchivesSpace through the API. It's become the basis of so much of our ArchivesSpace migration and ongoing work. Since our migration, our systems archivist, Nate Hutchison, has adopted this vital script in numerous ways to extend the script's capabilities. First, a bit about APIs. If you're not familiar, I was not when I first started migrating data. A common analogy for an API or an application programming interface is that it's like a waiter, the mediator between the diner and the kitchen. The user, the metaphoric diner, orders something off of a menu of allowable API calls. And the user can be a program, a script, or a real person. The API waiter takes the order to the program, the metaphoric kitchen, say ArchivesSpace, and returns with the specified food, the data. The analogy breaks down here because the user diner can also send food to the program kitchen data, but that exchange still happens through the metaphoric waiter. While imperfect, the waiter metaphor still helped me conceptualize what an API does. While information lives in ArchivesSpace in a database with tables, the ArchivesSpace API communicates the data in JSON. It's just a structured data format. It's an alternative to XML with different syntax and rules. Lots of braces, colons, and quotation marks. I've made numerous templates designed for the data cleanup program, Open or Find, to structure information you want to get into ArchivesSpace as JSON. So ArchivesSpace can convey, the API can convey where to put the information you want to update. Open or Find works with tabular data, and the templates take information in the columns and puts it in the right parts of the JSON. I have more in-depth documentation linked to in the slide, but it would take numerous trainings to go through how to work it specifically. So this is really high level. And I emphasize, if you want to try them out, do it in a test environment. Don't experiment on live data. Most of the bulk update scripts we use target a sub-record within a major record type. For instance, notes within a resource record, which I'll run with for the sake of example. Nested in the resource records, JSON is a section of all its notes. Within the notes part of the record are the nested subset records, if you will, the individual notes, the abstract, scope, contents, etc. In the documentation I made, I distinguish between two types of JSON templates. Update templates are used for scripts that either create or completely replace, for instance, the whole set of notes. They have the JSON structure for the whole note part. Append templates form the JSON for individual notes within the subrecord. They're called append because when I was developing them, I was typically tacking a new note onto an existing set of notes. But they can be used to replace, for instance, an abstract with the rewritten one. So these templates are made to be used with Open or Find to create a CSV that has the resource ID in one column and a properly formed JSON in another. This is broadly what using the update scripts might look like to add some abstracts. I create a project with the Open or Find, an Open or Find project with the text of the abstracts and the A-space IDs of the resources I want to add them to. And then I copy the appropriate template from my documentation, in this case, append for a note. In Open or Find, I use the template to make a new column with the JSON. I paste the template into the expression field, which specifies what to put in the new column. And then I change the blue text from the template from VizDesk to abstract to match my use case. Once the column is created, export using custom tabular exporter in Open or Find, which lets you export specific columns. It spits out a CSV. Technically, we specify a pipe separator because we don't use pipes for anything else, and they're easier for the script to interpret. And then I paste the path of the CSV into the right script and run it. I use PyCharm, but any IDE will do. So what the Python script does, it makes an API call to ArchivesSpace to grab the resource record with the ID listed in the first record of the CSV. ArchivesSpace returns the JSON of the resource. The script adds the new abstract to the end of the JSON. And then the script updates the resource via the API to ArchivesSpace, and then it moves on to the next record and continues this loop until it reaches the end of the CSV. So you can modify the script to append a new date to a set of date or set of dates in an archival object, or create new agent links in an accession. You just need to specify what part of what major record type you want to update. So our EAD exporter, a plugin you can install, our exporter linked to in the slide is based on the Bentley Historical Libraries. You may not be able to view it if you're not a UT institution, but feel free to email me and I'll send you the code. We don't want processors to have to touch the XML after Archive spits it out, and except for an occasional oddball error, mission accomplished. Our exporter isn't finalized and is catered to us. We intend to include more explanatory comments It works for ArchivesSpace version 2.8.1, so may not work for a different version, specifically earlier than 2.7, which treats language differently. We also don't want to touch this code again until TARO's done with development, because we don't want to base decisions on TARO display that might change. I can't answer a ton of technical questions about the exporter. Our system archivist maintains it, but I do work closely with him to test desired capabilities, to communicate desired capabilities and test it. So what it does, it adds TARO required encoding analog attributes. It removes ArchivesSpace IDs, the ref IDs that by default are exported otherwise. It adds properly structured header information the way TARO wants it, with our specific information, agency code links, and so forth. It structures index terms the way TARO wants them, but note that this breaks the staff side PDF exporter. It singularizes extent units when the number is 1. For instance, it exports 1 reel instead of 1 reels. It includes extent tags when it exports physical description notes, which we occasionally use at the resource level for prosaic descriptions of physical aspects of materials. It changes the language code from ZXX to ENG, the code for no linguistic content not applicable, which is right for some visual collections like photos, but ZXX isn't valid in EAD, so we put ENG there per TARO communications. The exporter does a lot to format dates, with the idea we want processors to have to edit as few fields as possible. It adds calendar and era attributes to unit dates, unit date tags if those fields are empty in ArchivesSpace. It adds commas between unit dates if a resource record archival object has more than one date subrecord. Normal equals years 0 to 0 for dates that don't have anything in begin or end, like undated. And then the exporter has specific logic relating to certainty and expression. We don't want processors to have to enter the same basic information in multiple fields, risking conflicts. If a date's approximate, it exports circa before each date and a date range, or just the beginning date if it's a single date. If the date is labeled as inferred, brackets around a single date or the whole date range. And if there's anything in expression, that's what gets exported above anything else, despite any other condition. We're thankful for our exporter every day. From here, we bulk exported our EAD using another Duke developed script that batch exports resource record EAD based on resource IDs you give it, and then checked for compliance. And then we reposted everything to TARO again, remediation complete. Oops. So actually, that's a mistake, but here are some resources that you guys might find useful, including, again, links to the documentation for using the templates and a bunch of other things. And I think we're at the questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Olivia. That was incredible. I know the one question I saw in the chat was about all of the links that you were sharing. So yes, after the webinar today, we will post this recording to our TARO YouTube channel, and I will send an email out to the listserv and on TARO Today with the presentations and links to all of the wonderful scripts and resources that all of our presenters have shared with us today. If anyone has a question for a particular institution or repository, or for all of our presenters in general, feel free, you can drop that in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself and ask, you are welcome to do that now. Thank you for the corgi, Joy. I guess my question is, does the corgi have a name?
Yes, Chicken. She's my soul dog. She passed away in August, but she's still, my heart dog.
A general question just for the ArchivesSpace presenters here is, why isn't there kind of a one-size-fits-all option for exporting TARO 2 finding aids from ArchivesSpace?
Well,
Toss
I
that
can
over
say
to-
for
Go ahead.
I can say for TSLAC that we're not there yet to the point where we would be creating a tool that would be something that would be shared. It sounds like most people actually are in the same boat where they're not at that point where they would be creating something that would be universally applicable, but I might be wrong.
I would say for our part that that's correct. I think it's possible. It's just that it's always going to require a little bit of customizing for your repository. Like really just at the minimum, at least you have to have it exporting the correct attribute information for the EAD ID, you know, to say it's your repository. Other than that, a lot of it could be common. It's just that as you do still have some choices in how you do things in ArchivesSpace, everybody could be doing things a little bit differently. But overall, it's possible, especially if those repositories are willing to, you know, make whatever accommodations to meet the common setup for ArchivesSpace TARO land.
Yeah, one of the reasons our systems archivist is a little not hesitant, but just wanted to make sure that when we shared our EAD exporter, like we had all the comments we needed to convey that like, this is for us, this is our choice based on decisions we made for ourselves. You know, all the things like the repository codes and all of that, of course, would have to be updated, but he wanted to make sure that those comments were really, really clear for others that might want to use it. So it's kind of use it at your own risk for some of our stuff, but.
The other thing, hi, I'm Molly and I'm from the Austin History Center, and we are hosted by Lyrasis, and we're just starting the process of migration, but I have been having conversations with Lyrasis about the fact that TARO exists, and there are all these standards with TARO 2.0, and there's a huge market out there for them to somehow possibly help with making there be an EAD exporter. So I think that I'm probably going to reach out to people who are on TARO that are hosted by Lyrasis and see if we can use our collective power to encourage that. But I will say Lyrasis has even bothered to go through the BPG. Like when I brought it up and I sent them the BPG, they actually read through it and had some comments. So it's a possibility. I just have to get through our migration of all of our finding aids first before I can start thinking about that. But I will definitely keep in touch about that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the lead on that. I think it'll be definitely something we can push for. A question for the Briscoe: how much time did it take to reconfigure the Bentley plugin?
Oh gosh, I didn't do it, so I'm not entirely sure, but I think Nate got it done not that long, maybe a couple months. I mean, there were a lot of testing. And then again, when we jumped versions, we had to do more testing because it changed the way like languages were handled and things like that. But not as long as I thought it might, actually. And this was also years ago.
That's a time in the pandemic has certainly flown and crawled by. Are there any other questions for our speakers today? Well, I want to thank Brian and Becky and Olivia and Amanda so much for sharing all of the amazing work that you guys have done and these resources. And thank you to all of the staff at your repositories for muscling through this and teamwork to help all of us here at TARO get this together.
Can
yes.
I say one thing? I just wanted to say, like, if any of you who are listening were listening to this and thinking, oh my God, that's too complicated, I would suggest that you contact one of us and have a one-on-one chat with somebody about how it might work at your place, because it might be easier than you think. Because if you already are familiar with Python or JSON formats or any of that, then you might be like, oh, we can do that. But if you're not, then you might just be thinking, no way. But it is possible. So I would encourage you to talk to someone about it who has some experience.
Thank you so much. Becky. Oh, go ahead, Becky.
Well, I just wanted to point out that we've got some shared our tools, notes about the tools that each of these repositories who presented has been talking about at that Google Drive link. So, and there might be some updating that needs to happen in those folders for each repository. So be patient and check back, and we'll get those up to date.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Just be on the lookout. We do have the in-person tarot workshops coming up. This week we'll be in San Marcos. Then we have one coming up in April in Dallas, and then at SSA in Houston. They're filling up fast. There are free hands-on training. So if you'd like to meet these trainers in person, you can find the information on the Tarot Today blog to register for one of those workshops. We will be having another webinar coming up next month looking at Tarot 2 and the browse search features and subject headings. So I hope you will join us there to find out how to maximize the browse search function and your finding aids. And with that, I will let you all go. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I will see you soon.